Why are we doing this, Top 10, Dr. Cooper?
Well, I think we're doing it mainly because there are things people can do that we underestimate, and that we don't want it to seem that there's nothing that makes a difference in our lifestyle for metabolism, because that's just not true. There are some very powerful lifestyle strategies that can really strengthen our metabolism.
And it's not all about just getting on drugs and taking some kind of Ozempic or Mounjaro or something that's very expensive. There are certain things that you could do that really don't cost a penny.
That's right. And then if you don't do them, also
Wah,
there's
wah.
consequences that your metabolism will be impaired due to that.
But I think we all have this idea that we have to go to this highly trained specialist to get this inside knowledge. But, you know, that inside knowledge in many ways is as simple as get a good night's sleep.
That's right.
Yeah,
It's like-
that doesn't cost anything.
That didn't cost anything.
it didn't
to
cost
find
anything.
out, but it has a profound impact on your health. This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. So good to see you two.
Hi.
Hello.
I would say good morning, but I don't know what time of the day or night people are listening to this.
That's right.
So I'm just going to say welcome from the Western United States of America. We have a lot of listeners all over the world. It's so great to have all of you here. On the show this week, we are breaking down the top 10 positive things you can do for your metabolism, and we're breaking it into two parts. So we'll do 6 through 10 this week. We'll do 1 through 5 next week. These are things that we guarantee will have an impact on your quality of life and your health. Did I oversell that, Dr. Cooper?
No. I say no.
No, I
Okay,
don't
Andrea.
think you did. I don't think you did. I think these are all things that really have an important place in our life.
Okay. Andrea, anything else before we launch in?
I think that these are we're very positive people, and I think that we thought that this would be a good idea because we thought that it would be a great thing to tell people about things that they can do easily that would be helpful alongside of whatever, if they're working with a doctor or if they're not working with a doctor. And these are just great lifestyle things that you can do, and you can just do on your own. Some of them you can't totally do on your own. You need a helper. But most of them, you really can make a difference in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we've all talked with friends. Just the other day, I was talking to a woman who said, I have just been struggling for years. I just don't feel right. And we started talking more about it. And that's not an uncommon conversation to have. And I think what this list of 10 things will do is open up people to the idea that there are actual solutions and there are things we can do daily that will actually have a profound impact. And it hurts me inside when I talk to people who've been struggling and they're kind of at wit's end. They've talked to doctors, they don't know what to do, they've tried various things, and they're still struggling. But this is all about hope, I think.
Right. And I like giving people some language, like when they go to their doctors or when they are talking about it or thinking about it or doing research about it. I like giving people some really concrete language that they might not have thought about to go and help themselves.
Okay, let's launch in. I would do a drum roll, but my snare drum is about 7 feet that way in the
darn.
podcast studio.
No.
Let's start out with number 10. Know your key numbers and get a workup.
This is so important.
So
it really is.
Let's break this down. Dr. Cooper, what does this mean? What are our key numbers?
Well, when it comes to our health, and we're talking about metabolic health and how to really have the healthiest metabolism we can. And so, as Andrea said, working alongside your practitioner that's working with your metabolic system and trying to strengthen it through other medical avenues, it would be kind of crazy not to be aware of some of these 10 things that we really need to be focused on that strengthen our metabolism. And it's for everybody, regardless of your weight, regardless of your blood sugar status. We all benefit from keeping our metabolism as healthy as possible. So starting out with the know your numbers is so critical because that's kind of your baseline. You want to know your baseline health and identify any risks that you might be dealing with so that you can be more aware and proactive in those areas. So knowing your numbers, I'd probably also include like your genetics, not that that's a number, but just being aware of your family history and your family risk factors. That would be falling under the category, I think, of know your numbers, know your background, know your vulnerabilities. But when we think about know your numbers, what are the important numbers to know? So heart disease is the number one killer for men and women. So we definitely need to know things that have to do with our cardiovascular health, which is blood pressure. We need to know about the blood pressure, and we have the systolic pressure and the diastolic. The systolic is the upper number, diastolic is the lower. And the new guidelines have actually taken a lot of us aback because they're pretty strict. And they're not that new now, but
Yeah, but I was still
yeah.
shocked the other day when I had an
Yes.
appointment with you.
Uh-huh.
I knew about the change in guidelines, but it's still every time kind of freaks me out because I did have high blood pressure. And I remember when high blood pressure was what I thought was really high blood pressure. But like now, high blood pressure is what I used to think was normal, which was like 120 over 80.
Right.
And that used to be like a goal.
Yeah,
And now that's considered high blood pressure.
that's right. Yeah.
So that to me was still very interesting. And I know it's old news, but it's interesting for people to know that.
Yeah,
It
let's
really
talk about
is.
what is the actual number that we should be concerned about.
Well, it's true. There are the ranges of what constitutes high blood pressure. So the optimal blood pressure would be if both numbers, the top number is under 120, the lower number is under 80. That's considered normal.
Under.
Under. Yeah. Normal blood pressure. If the top number drifts above 120, but the lower number is still under 80, that's considered elevated. But then if they're both elevated, they're both 120 over 80 or higher, that's stage 1 hypertension.
Yeah.
So it's true what Andrea said. Even when I was in training, 120 over 80 was considered like excellent blood
goal.
pressure. So these guidelines changed because they were seeing increased incidence of stroke and that we weren't being aggressive enough with blood pressure medication, and particularly in young people, which is really interesting. Young people, young males. So I think that's where the guidelines came from. But when doctors are focused on blood pressure, they have a hard time putting people on blood pressure medication if their blood pressure is 120 over 80 because there's always that risk it's going to be too low at times if you do that. And if it's too low, people will feel lightheaded, tired. So once you get a blood pressure number, the important thing to do is check several because you should really check at least 3 blood pressures on different days and see whether you're consistently in a high range or if it goes up and down. And so most likely doctors will just make note if it's a little elevated and keep tracking it over time. But the other important thing is a lot of people don't take the blood pressure measurement accurately. So it's very important to follow guidelines when you take your measurement to get an accurate result. Believe it or not, you're supposed to go to the bathroom and empty your bladder first.
Really?
And yes, and you don't see people doing that. But if you have to go to the bathroom, it raises your blood pressure. So you have to ideally make sure your bladder's empty, sit in a chair with both feet on the ground, planted on the ground, not cross-legged. And you're supposed to rest for a couple minutes before the blood pressure's taken. And so there's a lot of these little details that usually, even when you go to the doctor, it's not followed. You'd be rushing in, sitting down, checking your blood pressure, and you're still upset about the traffic on the way. So,
Yeah.
yeah. And so it's great if you have had borderline blood pressure problems, always get a blood pressure cuff at home. And unfortunately, the wrist cuffs, even though they're kind of easy to use, they're not that accurate, the wrist ones. So you want to get a digital one that goes around the arm, and you have to make sure that the cuff fits properly. There's markings on it to assure that it's fitting properly. And then checking the blood pressure with the correct protocol. And believe it or not, our blood pressure is the highest in the morning when we wake up. Within an hour of waking, because of our body trying to transition from sleeping to the stress of being awake.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and the cortisol levels that go up at that time of day, our blood pressure is the highest then. So I like to have patients check it then to see what the high range is. But if it starts showing that it's elevating throughout the day, later in the day, that's usually a stress response. So that might be an indicator that you're not handling stress during the day well enough. So
Yeah.
if it's high in the morning, that's very consistent with hypertension.
Dr. Cooper, I'm guessing that if somebody went to their doctor and said, I'm a little concerned, my blood pressure is 130/90, I'm guessing a lot of docs would say, that's not super high. Let's keep an eye on it. I mean, how many times have we heard that? Keep an eye
It's
on it.
true.
But like when I first came to you, I had high blood pressure. Like I was
Very
probably
high.
140 over something.
You were over
And my
90
doc
something or
kept saying,
100.
yeah, let's keep an eye on it. Let's keep an eye on it. And it just,
Yeah.
how do we get through? I mean, I guess I'm just channeling Andrea right now
Yeah.
because you don't take no for an answer if you think that you are in the right.
Right. But it's really hard because we as a society and sort of as we grew up are sort of channeled to listen to our doctors and put them on a pedestal and go, okay, look, my blood pressure has been as high as 160. So on the top number. And I was like, oh, that's bad. Okay, let's take as many pills as I can to get it down. I don't want that. And I did, and it is not that. But when I first started years and years ago, I mean, the goal was 120/80. And now, so it's still in my head that is where to
That's a
go.
good blood pressure.
Yeah.
Well, I
And
think
so we have to go through this
Yeah.
kind of quickly, but I
Okay.
just wanted to just plant the seed with our listeners. And it's not just about metabolic health.
Right.
I had a friend who had high blood pressure, had a massive stroke, and lived the rest of his life in a nursing home with assisted living.
Oh, jeez.
Stroke is a huge one. Kidney
It's
damage is
big.
another huge one. If you
Kidney
have high
damage.
blood pressure, you can ruin your kidneys and have to have a kidney
Right.
transplant.
Yeah. And also your heart muscle can thicken. So you can develop what's called a hypertensive cardiomyopathy where your heart is stiff. It's one of the elements of the cardiovascular health. And what's particularly bad is if your blood pressure is high and you also have elevated cholesterol levels, like especially LDL cholesterol, which is nicknamed the bad cholesterol, because LDL can actually cause plaque deposits in the arteries. So if you have plaque deposits in your coronary arteries or in your carotid arteries, which are the ones that supply your brain, you can have either a stroke. If your blood pressure is high, it can kind of push some of that plaque loose and it can lodge in your brain and cause what's called an ischemic stroke, which is the most common type of stroke that we see. Or if you have plaque in your arteries, you can have a heart attack. If you have plaque in your aorta, you can have an aortic dissection. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are dangerous if you develop plaque in your arteries, ranging from stroke, heart attack, to just even dementia. There's something called multi-infarct dementia, which is like a lot of small plaque and small blood vessel blockages in the brain that lead to dementia as we age. So one thing you want to know is your whole cholesterol profile. And this is another area where most people, when they're checking cholesterol, they're looking at the basic numbers. That's total cholesterol, LDL, which we said is the bad cholesterol, HDL, which is more favorable because it can negate some of the negative impact of the bad cholesterol, the LDL, and triglycerides. And those are the basic numbers. We call them the surface numbers. But you can look a lot deeper because then what you want to find out is when it comes to LDL cholesterol, the very small particles of LDL are dense and sticky, and those are the ones that trigger the most plaque risk. And so what you want to find out is about your particles of LDL. Do you have a high number of particles? Are your particles small and sticky? And keep track of that information as well. And then in addition to that, there's other markers that have now been shown to be very much associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and plaque formation. And some of those are genetic, such as lipoprotein A. That is a genetic risk marker.
Is that the one I have?
Yes, that's the one you have. And if that's elevated, it automatically increases your risk of plaque formation by about 40%.
Yeah.
And so in patients like that, there's not really good strategies to reduce the lipoprotein A through lifestyle. And even medication doesn't do that well at reducing lipoprotein A. So then it becomes even more important to have very low levels of LDL and LDL cholesterol particles, even lower than you would if you didn't have that risk marker. And then another one is called apolipoprotein B. And that also significantly increases the chances that plaque can form in the arteries. And that one definitely responds really well to improving metabolic health. And so if that's elevated, as you improve your metabolic health, it tends to come down. So that one is more modifiable than the lipoprotein A marker. And then the last one that I'll talk about with the cholesterol profile that we like to get is something called TMAO, which we'll talk about again probably as we go through this list. But it is a byproduct of unhealthy gut flora, bacteria, or viruses or any kind of microbiomes in our system. And if they're unhealthy, they produce this TMAO, which is associated with increased cardiovascular risk. So that would be part of like your actual full-on cholesterol workup, probably also including, there's another one called high sensitivity CRP, which is an inflammation marker. So that sounds like a lot of things, but it's all part of one panel. And that panel is nicknamed Cardio IQ by Quest or NMR lipoprofile by LabCorp. Those are two major labs that do run them. There's also other forms of it called the Berkeley panel, the VAP panel. So you want to talk to your doctor about getting more of an in-depth analysis of your cholesterol cardiovascular risk. So then you take that, if that's heightened, that risk is heightened, and your blood pressure is elevated, you really do have significant risk that you want to address. The last thing for the cardiovascular health is the coronary artery calcium scoring, heart scan.
Oh, yeah. The heart
That's
scan.
another number you want to know. What is your coronary artery calcium score? And so that makes a big difference because if you have a 0, it means you have no coronary artery plaque, which really means that in spite of the numbers that you might see, there's not the pathology of plaque formation. But if it's not 0, it means you do have coronary artery disease, that you are a person that is forming plaque and you already have the disease. And so that puts you in a much higher risk group.
Yeah.
So
I think the saddest medical problem in the world is when someone who is just living life and loving life just drops dead at 60 of a heart attack. And I've had friends that this has happened to, and this is so preventable. And I think that's one of the reasons, isn't it, that when people first come to see you, Dr. Cooper, you want to know the baseline because you don't want to get that surprise.
you said it exactly. We don't want the patients to have that surprise, and we don't want that surprise. That we would feel awful as a healthcare provider if you miss that. But in addition to the cardiovascular health, of course, it's the diabetes risk factors, diabetes in particular, and that is knowing your numbers when it comes to your fasting glucose. So remember, under 100 is considered normal, but 100 to 125 is considered prediabetes. 126 and higher is diabetes. And then there's another marker called the HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c. And that one is an indirect way to measure what your glucose has been doing for the past few months. And it's on a single blood test. But what it represents is the percent of your hemoglobin that is saturated with glucose. And our blood, our hemoglobin, is a component of our blood that turns over every few months. And so that way, if we're measuring that hemoglobin, we know that that's reflecting that last few months of glucose. And we're measuring to see how much glucose is attached to that hemoglobin. And so based on that, you can get a sense of whether you're in the normal range, which would be 5.6 or under, or if you're in prediabetes, which is 5.7 to 6.4, or if you're in full-blown diabetes, which is 6.5 and higher. And if you're in diabetes, above 7 is considered uncontrolled diabetes, so it's more severe. So those are important numbers for glucose. And it also would be great if you could find out what your insulin levels are as well, your fasting insulin. The fasting insulin related to the glucose is what you really want to look at. And there's just different ways of assessing it. One of the kind of shortcut ways would be if you took the glucose and you divide it by the insulin, that number, if it's 7 or less, kind of suggests there's insulin resistance there. So you want to be above 7. But then if it's above 15, that ratio, that means that you probably have what we call the selfish brain. So if you have a normal glucose, but your insulin is very suppressed, remember, when our glucose is up, the insulin is the hormone that helps our tissues take up the glucose. So when our glucose goes up, our insulin's supposed to go up to pull that glucose out of our bloodstream into the tissues so our body can use it for energy. So if our insulin's not responding to a high glucose, it's either diabetes, if you're in the really high glucose range, a diabetes
Which means
range,
your body just isn't producing enough
isn't
insulin,
producing
right?
insulin.
Yeah.
But if you're not in a diabetes range and you're seeing this, it means that your brain is intervening, saying, don't make the insulin because we're starving and we don't want the muscles to take up the fuel. We want to steal the fuel from the rest of the body. So we did an episode on the selfish brain that maybe you could check for that 'cause it's a little bit complicated.
And as Andrea says, it's all in your brain.
It's all in your brain,
Right.
which is crazy. I never understood that before.
And I
Right.
guess as we're wrapping up this discussion of know your key numbers, Dr.
Right.
Cooper, the definition of metabolic syndrome is having several of these maladies all
Yes.
at once, which is, I was a mess when I first came to you. High
Yep.
blood pressure, high cholesterol, insulin resistance, high
Yes.
blood sugar, the whole
Yep,
nine
that's
yards.
all metabolic syndrome. And maybe the
Yeah.
last marker that kind of feeds into standard metabolic syndrome would be looking at liver enzymes, which are ALT and AST, particularly ALT. If you see elevation of that marker, that's also a red flag. And when it came to the cholesterol panel, the one thing to mention is if you do see elevated triglyceride levels and a low HDL cholesterol, that's also very characteristic of metabolic syndrome.
Okay. Andrea, do you want to take us into number 9?
Number 9, physical activity. Some people are big activity people and it's no problem, and they're at the gym every day, or they're running, or that's, their thing. I mean, they sell a lot of athletic clothing, so
Yeah.
people must be doing it.
But you know what, Andrea? I'm a big proponent of working activity into your everyday life. How often do we circle a parking lot to get that spot right in front of a store when what you should do is
Park the furthest
park 50
away.
yards away and walk?
Right.
But
Right.
I'm not a
I've
doctor.
read about that. I've read about that.
Dr. Cooper, I think what a lot of people wonder is what's the minimum activity we should have, and what should we aspire to when it comes to activity as it relates to health?
Well, the activity is going to bring a lot of improvements if you think about it. It improves your ability to do things in your daily life, especially as you age. If you start thinking about how difficult is it to carry these
Right.
groceries around, to walk
Move it or lose it.
It's true. And we want to start early enough so that we can still make those fitness improvements in time to protect us as we age, but also beneficial for bone density, beneficial for heart health, beneficial for dementia prevention. So there's so many areas where physical activity is so important. And I think it is important that it's something that you can work into your life and that it makes you happy, that you enjoy doing it. Because if you don't enjoy doing it, you're not going to continue to do it. It'll just be a phase that you go through. It's also important to not approach physical activity as kind of an all or nothing kind of a venture, because if you're pushing yourself really hard in that workout, studies have shown that people then tend to be very sedentary the rest of the day. because they're tired. And so then their overall benefit ends up being less than if you did something that was more moderate or lighter that you incorporate into your daily life and you stay at a certain level of activity throughout the day without feeling like you have to lay down and recover from a hard workout. So that's something to keep in mind. But I mean, ideally, if there's no contraindications, we want to do some kind of physical activity that both strengthens our muscles and our bones, and then something that strengthens our heart. And so that would be strength or resistance training, or some type of activity that challenges our muscles. So that could be walking up hills, hiking, it could be biking up hills, it could be swimming because there's a lot of resistance involved in water. Or it could be lifting weights or doing some kind of a core strengthening program through yoga or Pilates. But hitting the muscles is important and strengthening those. And then from a cardiovascular standpoint, there's these physiologic training zones that bring health benefits. And what we find is if you train too hard too much of the time, that's actually strengthening the part of our fitness that's called the anaerobic system, which isn't really the target that we really want for our health. We want to step back and lower the intensity a bit and focus more on something that you could maintain over time. And so it's okay to do some high intensity bursts and things like that, but the percent of the training that's in that high intensity range should not be the majority, is what I'm getting at. But it can be things like doing housework. It can be doing yard work. It can be taking your dog out for the walks. As long as you're not always in a leisure mode where if you feel like it's at least a little bit challenging, then you're probably getting considerable benefit.
I think that's such great advice that you have to enjoy doing it. And when you say lifting weights, I know a lot of people think, oh, I can't be a weightlifter. I have a friend, a woman in her 70s, who is a competitive weightlifter and holds several national records for deadlifting weights.
Wow.
In her 70s. And
That's
so
amazing.
when you talk about, find something that you like. I love to golf. And I hooked up with some guys recently and started golfing with them, and they never take a power cart. They always take a push cart and walk. And I'll tell you, walking 18 holes over 4.5 hours, that's a great workout.
Yeah.
And it takes a
And it's
long
fun.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my wife would say, and a lot of money.
Well, that too.
And the one thing we should always mention when we're talking about physical activity and exercise, it's really about fueling it. And we'll talk about that with one of our other tips. But that just also means that it's not really healthy, the exercise, if you're not fueling it. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's great. Number 8, let's move on to stress. And we've talked about stress, Dr. Cooper. And I guess the point is you have to understand that you're under stress to be able to address it. And I think a lot of us don't know in our everyday lives how much stress we're dealing with. But this is a really important factor for overall health, and especially metabolic health. What does stress do to our metabolism, Dr. Cooper?
Oh, it's really harmful metabolically, stress. I think it's really the hardest thing that we as practitioners have to deal with our patients because we don't really have great tools for them. It's almost like people are on their own trying to figure out how to adjust their life so that the stress isn't just overwhelming them. So, of course, the stress, you want to find out what could you do about it. So it doesn't mean you have to see a therapist. Does it mean you need to change your life and start saying no to things that you've said yes to? Does it mean you might need a job change? What does it mean? You want to think about that. But the stress itself is so damaging because it leads to other lifestyle activities that are also not healthy sometimes. That's one thing to consider. And the other thing is that it triggers hormone imbalances. And so if you do have insulin resistance, having a lot of stress increases the severity of the insulin resistance in your body. It changes your hormones. And one of the ways that it does that is through effects on cortisol and the cortisol system. The cortisol system in the body responds to our stress. It's one of our fight or flight mechanisms, and it helps us adapt to stress. So if we do have stress, we do need more cortisol to help us deal with the stress, because once the cortisol activates, it kind of helps our body release more energy, to deal with stress. But the problem with that is the cortisol elevating kind of robs our metabolism of strength. And so it weakens our metabolism in many ways. So stress affects our ghrelin levels. It makes our ghrelin, which is that hunger hormone, it makes it elevate. And then when the ghrelin is elevated, it further aggravates the cortisol. So you start to get into this chemical soup that starts to really impair metabolic function, blood sugar regulation, just overall energy levels. And so and then it sets you up, as I said, for other unhealthy behaviors to try to cope with the stress.
Andrea, you worked in corporate
Yeah.
America for a long time.
Very stressful.
Very stressful. Did you have any strategies on dealing with stress?
Well, sometimes I ate pretzels for dinner because
Anything we can talk about on the program?
well, because there was like no time. I mean, you work really late.
Yeah.
You don't eat properly because you're working through your meals. It's really hard to eat properly. Look, I worked through the 70s and 80s. There was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of drinking for pleasure and non-pleasure, I think. And the pressures, I also, during the so-called go-go 80s, I mean, there was a lot of pressure to deliver. And there was a lot of fun, I'm not going to lie. And I worked in the golden age, I think the golden age of media and the golden age of cable television, but there was a lot of work to do. And you had to get it done, and you had to work overnight a lot of times. You had to get things done, and it was very stressful. No sleep, no good food, or too much good food. And it's not healthy.
Yeah.
No matter how you look. I didn't even know about metabolism then. I just knew I had a bad metabolism, but it wasn't healthy.
Yeah.
It's not healthy lifestyle. It's not a healthy living. It's not healthy living. It doesn't lend itself to being healthy. I think corporate life is a little different now. There's, and I think the stresses are very different now. There's so much pressure to do the right thing. Am I saying the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? When I was a corporate executive, I'm sure I did all the wrong things. But it was a different kind of stress. And I think everybody also makes their own kind of stress. And sometimes you stress about your metabolism. And then that becomes its own kind of stress that you feed on. How many people are stressing about, oh my God, am I eating the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Should I eat this tomato? How many bites of pasta can I eat? No bread, no tomatoes, no steak, no this. Even that.
Yeah.
Right. We should also mention about other stress that's like that ingrained stress that we see with people of color that are dealing with
Oh, yeah. Or if you live in a
implicit
food desert.
bias and people also with neurodivergent status that have to function in the world with the neurotypical people. And so some groups of people have just inborn more stress as their baseline. And so
Right.
we should really also recognize that because that's something that is very hard to deal with. But I think knowing where your stress is coming from is good, and also just so acknowledging it and affirming, yes, this is stressful, is good instead of just burying it. Because I
Yeah.
do feel like that when people are burying the stress,
It makes it triple.
it does.
Triple, quadruple, gazillion, whatever. But it's worse.
Having someone to talk to, a friend or a therapist. And then some of our listeners have written in talking about the value of meditation.
Yeah.
And so exploring different options with maybe people who are in the know.
I think
Yeah.
that helps. And I do think that sometimes having a plan of how to deal with things, that helps too, especially with the food part of it. That helps too.
Yeah. I think as I did sort of a stress audit as I left television news 3 years ago, in my life, I just tried to figure out what's causing me stress. Can I change it? If not, can I accept it? And then
Right.
accept it and move on. But just to agonize over that stuff over and over is really
Doesn't help.
Doesn't help. Yeah.
No,
But there are.
But some things you're like, this is going to probably sound terrible, but some things that cause stress, sometimes you realize, you know what, I kind of thrive on it. There are certain things that you're like, you know what, I kind of like that. Maybe you get a rush from it and you do kind of deal with it.
Yeah.
And you accept that part of you. It may be messed up, but you say, I do like that competition part. Not me always, but I do think that there are some people who love that competition aspect of it and want that little rush.
And I think
And
that's fine. I mean,
I
but
think that's
then,
okay, but just not all the time.
well,
Yeah.
also I think if you are that type of person, then you need to make room in the rest of your life for that.
Yes,
Because when we think about how stress affects us, it's almost like it's a cup. We have a cup that we're filling with our
yeah,
stress. And so sometimes you have to compromise. If you're taking on this role and this task and you are getting stimulated by it, you enjoy it, and you want that in your life, then you're going to have
right.
to potentially remove something else that's the stressor.
Right. And maybe that can't be how you affect everybody else all the time, too.
I mean, yeah, stress serves a purpose because sometimes it helps us get ready for important moments in our lives.
Right.
We've got about 5 minutes to cover the last two. So we've
Uh-oh.
covered know
Uh-oh.
your key numbers, physical activity, stress, and number 7 is gut health and the
The
microbiome.
guts.
And I just had my labs at your office this week, Dr. Cooper, and I think the phlebotomist said that we are tracking some sort of marker that measures that you talked about earlier in the program.
Yeah,
Right?
that's the TMAO level. And so we just want to see that because with our patients with metabolic dysfunction or cardiovascular risk, it's really good to do that little measurement just in case it gives you a clue that the microbiome is not entirely healthy. And if it's not healthy, there are strategies we can implement through the dietary changes, and potentially a medical grade probiotic might be helpful as well in those cases. And then we can track that over time, and then we'll understand that at least that is not contributing to an increased risk in the metabolic arena or the cardiovascular, because we now know that our gut health affects so much. I mean, even every month we're finding out that it affects more than we knew before. And so the organisms are in our gut that are helping us process nutrients and digest and absorb these nutrients. It really makes an impact on our cardiovascular health, our metabolic health in terms of diabetes risk, obesity risk, but also now they're finding neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's
Wow.
disease. Yes. And so we really do need to keep an eye on it and have a better way to approach it. And I think there's a lot of strategies out there that aren't necessarily proven. So you have to be a little bit careful for falling for the fads. But I would definitely put that marker, as we mentioned it in the Know Your Numbers section, in there, because at least it gives you some evidence of what's going on. And then focusing on the microbiome health, it really mostly is from food. And so just keeping a varied diet, again, whole foods, trying to avoid the chemical additives, the artificial sweeteners, avoiding all that, but keeping in the diet a lot of produce, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, legumes, and all of those great fats that we always recommend with nuts and avocados and things like that. So it's kind of the same type of dietary strategy that you would do for just overall health, but the addition of probiotic foods and prebiotic foods. Probiotic foods would be things that have live organisms in them, like fermented foods such as sauerkraut, pickles, and kimchi, tempeh, miso, yogurt, kefir, that type of thing. And then the prebiotic foods are things that the microorganisms like to eat. And so that is onions, garlic, all of the produce that we talked about. And so if we keep our gut happy with all of that, usually that TMAO level comes out looking really good. So then you don't have to take necessarily a probiotic.
Andrea, you've kind of experimented
Yeah.
at that foofy store that you go to.
I like at my Erewhon, where you can get a $20, you know, a $20 shake.
Yeah, but have you noticed a difference when you take a probiotic? I mean,
I don't know. I take the probiotic, and I have, as I said, this yogurt drink that I got that I think has probably too much sugar because it tastes so fantastic. It's filled with fruit, but I don't know. It tastes delicious. I try and do the probiotic all the time because I know that is something I probably need, and I don't have enough beans in my life. And I try and drink and eat some cabbage and sauerkraut and things like that. But I actually, in my last appointment with Dr. Cooper, talked about like adding some more lentils and beans and things like that. And even my housekeeper told me to eat more lentils the other day.
oh my
That was
gosh.
a coincidence.
It was really a coincidence. She's like, "You need more lentils in your life."
But I don't know about you two, but when I eat just a diversity of fruits and veggies and good stuff, I just feel better.
Yeah,
I
I
just
think
feel
it's
better. Sometimes for a late night snack, I'll just have a piece of fruit or something. But that variety of fresh stuff really just keeps the digestive system going, doesn't it?
Yeah, and a little
yeah.
warning, if you're not used to it, there's like a acclimation period where you
There's some
have to acclimate
gassiness.
to it.
There's some
Yep,
gassiness
that's
involved.
right.
But the
Yeah, you've
gas
been
is
warned.
the probiotic
You,
pro.
you know it's work. You know it's
Pro
working.
part. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that was gut health. And last on our list this week, number 6, substances.
Yes.
Alcohol, nicotine. What other substances, Dr. Cooper, and how do they impact our metabolic health?
Well, and there's drugs, illicit drugs or recreational drugs. And I think this ties into the stress part that we talked about because I think you guys, Andrea, was talking
Yeah.
about how when the stress levels are heightened, people are turning to mood
Yeah.
mood
Oh
modulators
yeah.
and trying to medicate their stress level through maybe alcohol, which is really not a great idea, or other recreational drugs. And so one of the problems there is that the stress itself can just lead to substance abuse problems and increases in substance abuse. But some of the, or I should say substance overuse, I guess. But some of the things like, say, alcohol, for example, alcohol can have a strong impact on that neurotransmitter we talk about, agouti-related peptide. It can actually really increase it. And that's not something we want to do because agouti-related peptide has a very kind of negative impact on the health of our metabolism. We need some agouti-related peptide, otherwise we would have no appetite and waste away. So we need some that helps us stay hungry enough to feed ourselves and maintain a normal weight. But if that agouti-related peptide gets really high, it starts to promote obesity, very strong insulin elevations, and contribute to risk of diabetes and all kinds of hypertension and other negative things. So alcohol can actually increase that neurotransmitter. And so that's one reason we try to advise our patients to stay away from alcohol as much as possible. And then if we think about nicotine, the funny thing about nicotine is it does the opposite. So some people gravitate to nicotine as kind of to medicate their metabolism, which sounds weird, but that's why we've seen in the past that obesity rates kind of started to increase when the stop smoking campaigns really kicked in, because the smoking was medicating obesity, which sounds bizarre, but it does it by canceling out some of these negative metabolic signals in the brain. It acts like almost like a medication. But nicotine is so damaging for our health. I mean, it is just the worst thing you can do, one of the worst things you can do. So it's much better to use actual medication for your metabolism than to turn to nicotine for that. And when people do that, it's kind of like subconsciously. So I find like people gravitate to alcohol sometimes if they have insulin problems. Alcohol is a fuel that the body can use, just like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. But alcohol doesn't require insulin to access that fuel. So people with insulin problems often will gravitate to alcohol because their body knows they can extract the fuel more easily from the alcohol. So that can be also driven by metabolic dysfunction, that craving for alcohol. And then the nicotine, same thing, people's body kind of gravitates to it because if they happen to have elevation of what a agouti-related peptide, AGRP, or neuropeptide Y, that's the other hunger signal from the hypothalamus, both of those elevations, the nicotine kind of calms it down. So the person may kind of subconsciously gravitate to that because they feel kind of more normal with this nicotine in their system. So those would be red flags that there could be a metabolic driver of that substance use. And so looking more for actual medication or pharmacology that's safe to target those things rather than turning to those dangerous substances.
Well, we used to say we would smoke instead of eating, like we would smoke instead of eating. And if, like, I don't think it happens as much now, but like fashion models during Fashion Week all used to smoke because they would smoke and not eat.
Right, because by lowering those famine signals, it takes away the hunger.
Yeah.
But another thing to think about is our melanocortin pathway. That's the pathway that regulates the metabolism in the brain. So the agouti-related peptide and neuropeptide Y are at one part around the hypothalamus. But as the signals go through, there's another section called the POMC pathway, which also is where we process our own bodies like cocaine and amphetamines. So it's also kind of called the CART system, and that's for cocaine and amphetamine and production. So our own body generates drugs out of that system, including endorphins. Those are our feel-good drugs. And so if we have blockages there due to metabolic glitches, that's another area where people could gravitate to cocaine, amphetamines, and other substances, narcotics. So it could be that subconsciously people are gravitating to substances to compensate for glitches in their metabolic pathway. But at the same time, by using those substances, it actually amplifies the glitches in the metabolic pathway. So anyway, that's a fascinating connection. But I think also stress, because stress uses that pathway too. So that's why when we have elevated stress, people are turning more to these substances for that kind of medicating effect. And so we just want to be aware of it and try to discuss that also with your healthcare provider. I know there can be like shame or hiding around substance use, but it's very good to get that out in the open and try to figure out if there's connections of why that's happening. And this also ties into why we're seeing now that almost any medication that improves metabolic function seems to be reducing cravings for alcohol or substances too. So people may be surprised by that, but it's not that surprising because, again, our metabolic pathway, the strength of it, reduces the need for us to turn towards substances to medicate glitches and things like that.
Well, you know what we say, glitches are bitches.
Yes, we say that.
We do, and we say it proudly on this show. Well, this has been fun. So we went 10 through 6. We're going to go 5 through number 1 on the top 10 positive things to do for your metabolism. So in review, number 10, know your key numbers and get a workup. Number 9, physical activity. Number 8, stress. Number 7, gut health. And number 6, substances check. So this has been super fun. A great conversation once again. Thanks, you two, for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.